All right, good morning once again. It may be no surprise to you, we're picking up in 1 Peter this morning in 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. And we've been in this book a few Sundays, and we're looking at it from the standpoint of grace. I'm kind of using the outline from the Rari Study Bible, where it focuses on grace, because I do believe that's one of the key things that Peter's talking about. In chapter 5, in verse 12, he says, "Through Silvanus, our faithful brother, I have written to you briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God." And so we're kind of following that line of thought, and we finished the first section last week. A life of grace is a life of blessing. And that covered verses 3 through 12, where we looked at all the blessings that we have as Christians, especially tied to the salvation we have enjoyed through Jesus Christ on the basis of our faith. Well, this morning we're going to get into the next section, and that is that grace means soberness. Soberness. Now that term is used a little bit different than what we think of it today. It doesn't just mean not being drunken with alcohol. It has a deeper meaning, and we'll talk about it more here in a moment. But that's kind of the theme running through this next section. That based upon the blessings that we have in Jesus Christ, in particular the salvation that we've enjoyed, it ought to lead us into a particular type of lifestyle and a whole different angle at life than perhaps we had before. And so we'll be picking up in chapter 1 in verse 13 as we get into this section. And we'll be reading verses 13 through 16. If you'd like to read along, I think that would be helpful. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 13. It says, "Therefore prepare your minds for action, keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves in all your behavior, because it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" Okay, so this section starts out with a therefore, and as we saw time and time again in the book of Ephesians, when you see the word therefore, you need to know what it's there for. And what it's there for is to tie together what was previously written with that which is about to be written. What he has talked about and what he's about to talk about. And what he had previously talked about, as we just mentioned, was the great blessings that we have as Christians. We've been born to a living hope, where once we had a dead hope just constrained to this world, to the philosophies of man, the ideas of man, within the containment of this physical realm. Now we have a living hope that goes beyond this life and is based upon a truth revealed to us through Jesus Christ. And because of that, we have obtained a great salvation. And we hold on to that salvation through our faith in Jesus Christ. Therefore, so then that ought to cause something to change within you and within me. It ought to do something to us. And I want you to take note of, as we go through these verses, how much Peter focuses on the inward aspect of the Christian. He's going to get into some outward activities of the Christian, some behaviors that we ought to be engaged with in the way that we relate to others and so on and so forth. But what he first focuses on is what's going on within us. And so our salvation, the blessings tied to that salvation, ought to inwardly cause a change within. And the first thing he talks about is the mind. He says, prepare your minds for action. Now, I'm reading from the New American Standard, and I'm a big fan of the New American Standard. That's why I preach out of it. However, the reason I like the New American Standard is it's a very literal translation, and usually the translators stay out of the business of trying to interpret it for you instead of just translating it. But the New American Standard translators didn't do that in this case. The King James Version actually gives you the literal translation of this. It's gird up the loins of your mind. Now I can understand why the translators would help us out there, because a person who's not familiar with ancient history, don't know anything about their dress back then, he or she would read gird up the loins of your mind and be like, what in the world is that talking about? And so they're trying to help us out. But I think in doing so, we miss out on kind of what he's actually trying to teach us, what he's trying to tell us. What does it mean to gird up the loins? Well, back in ancient times, they didn't have blue jeans like we have today. A lot of times they were wearing flowing garments like they wear in the Middle East even today. And so, let's say you needed to go chase after your cow or you needed to run from somebody. You didn't want these flowing garments getting in your way, tangling up in your legs and making it hard to move. So what you would do is you would actually take the bottom part of your garment and you'd bind it up and you'd tie it together on your waist so that your legs would be free and you could take off running. And that's what Peter is borrowing off of. We saw this in Ephesians chapter 6 when it talked about gird yourselves with the belt of truth. In other words, binding yourself, getting you ready, prepared by binding yourself with the truth. And that's why the New American Standard translators translate this, prepare your minds for action, because that's what a person would do. When they were ready to engage in a particular action, they would gird up their loins. They would bind up their garments. But when we're talking about the mind, and if you talk about preparing for action, I think you kind of make the statement a little ambiguous. Because when you think about girding up the loins of your mind, the idea here is that your mind must have been loosed to begin with. Your mind has been loosed, and what it needs is to be bound up. It needs to be brought back together and put straight again. You know, many times, and this is one of the struggles of the Christian life, is that many times we find ourselves with a loose mind. A loose mind, a flowing mind, a mind that is not constricted, but a mind that just kind of goes wherever it pleases. A mind that goes down dark places, a mind that can go down lustful places, a mind that can go down all the wrong places. And when that happens, and when we don't have our mind girded up, bound up, it can cause problems in the Christian life. The mind is very, very important in the Christian life. Paul focuses a lot on the mind in his writings. In Romans chapter 8, he kind of gives us this picture of the mind being like a hinge. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Romans chapter 8 and verse 5, where he says, "For those who are according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who are according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." And so the mind is somewhat of a hinge between the flesh and the spirit. Now, our doors these days, they usually only open one way, but you might remember in the old westerns, you know, they had the barroom door, and you go in this way, and the doors would open this way. And then when you were coming out, you could open up the doors that way. They kind of swung both ways. And the type of hinges that they used on those doors allowed them to do that. And the mind is kind of like one of those hinges. Your whole life can be either focused on the flesh or your whole life can be focused on the spirit based upon your mindset, where your mind is. And so the mind is extremely, extremely important. And so Paul was very intent on making sure that people understood certain truths. He engaged people's mind. He wanted people's minds to be filled with the knowledge of God, the knowledge of the truth, who they were. He goes through a lot of things. As a matter of fact, the prayer in Ephesians chapter 1 is based upon him wanting them to have knowledge, wisdom, revelation, and to be enlightened. All of those things he wanted them to have because the mind is so important. And so it is important that we tend to our mind and that we take hold of and control of our minds. So that's what we got to do. We got to gird up our minds and get control of it again. But a person might ask, well, how do you do that? Because doesn't it take the mind to control the mind? First, you have to think about controlling the mind, and then control the mind. It can be difficult. Well, you have to bring it from another source. There's something that within you, and there's something within I that goes even deeper than the mind, and that is the will. If you're going to take control of your mind, if you're going to gird up your mind, it's got to be on the basis of your will. You've got to have the will to do it. There is a difference between your will and your mind, even though your will is connected to your mind. Because if you think about it, let's say a person has really strong willpower against eating ice cream. I personally don't share in that willpower with ice cream, but some people have very strong willpower when it comes to ice cream. So you could put a tub of ice cream right here, Bluebell ice cream, maybe, I don't know, vanilla. I like the cookies and cream. But anyways, you had ice cream here. And that person's mind is engaged because they see the ice cream. They know that it tastes good and that they would like it if they ate it. But there's something deeper within that tells them, no, I'm not going to eat it. Because they have made a predetermination that they were not going to eat ice cream, that they were going to watch what they ate. And so their will would engage even though their mind would tell them otherwise. And so you can see the difference there. So when our will is strengthened, it can actually control our mind. So if you want to control your mind, if you want to gird up the loins of your mind, it's got to come from something deeper. It has to come from your very will. It says, you know what? And a lot of times this comes from a crisis moment. And I don't mean a crisis necessarily in some catastrophic thing that happens in your life, but some point in your life where you say, it's enough. No more. I have a friend he's a state trooper, and he kind of let himself go. He had to go to the border. I'm not talking about the restaurant, the border. He had to actually go to the border and do service there. And when he go there, of course, he didn't have his wife's good home cooking. He'd eat out. He wasn't exercising, and he said he just felt so bad. He was gaining weight. But he remembers there was this defining moment where he said, no more. I'm not going to do it anymore. And he actually got involved in a fitness program and actually became a coach connected to this fitness program, controlled the way he ate, and he's been a changed person ever since. But there was that crisis moment where he says, that's enough. And when it comes to our minds, we have to have that moment where we say, that's enough. I'm tired of having these thoughts. I'm tired of always having my mind go into the dark places. I'm tired of my mind always going in the wrong places. I'm tired of my mind just being loose and going wherever it will go. I want control of my mind. And when we get that will within us to say, look, I want to bind up my mind and be in control of my mind and not let my mind be in control of me, then we've made progress. Then we made progress because we're attacking it from a deeper source than just the mind itself. So gird up the loins of your mind. Why would Peter tell his readers to gird up the loins of their mind? Why did they need to be controlled? Why did they need to control their minds? Well, there's two possible answers to that. The first one is something that he had already talked about previously. In verse 6, he talks about the trials that they were going through. He says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. Peter is writing to a group of people who were going through some very difficulties, probably persecution, based upon some other things he says throughout the book. They were being persecuted for their faith. And so they were going through these trials. And whenever you're going through a trial or a difficulty, no matter what degree it's going, no matter what degree it is, there is a tendency to let our minds go in the wrong direction, to begin to focus on the wrong things, to begin to get the wrong priorities, to begin to think negative thoughts, to begin thinking the most horrible scenarios, and begin just really letting your mind just get the best of you and being overtaken by anxiety, fear, whatever else. And so when we go through difficulties and trials, that's really a crucial moment when we have to, within our will, say, look, I am going to take control of my mind. I'm going to bind it up and not let it go in those wrong places and cause me to drift away from God. So it could be because of their trials, but it also could be about what he is about to speak about, where he says in verse 14, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts, which was yours in your ignorance. And so, by binding up your mind, girding up the loins of your mind, taking control of your mind, it will also protect you from allowing your mind to go into places it ought not to go, and therefore lead you into sin. In James chapter 1, James gives us kind of the process by which we fall into sin, and therefore sin produced death in us. James chapter 1, and we'll start in verse 14. It says, but each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. And when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. So a person commits sin we might just focus on the fact that they committed the act, but there's a whole process that took place, usually before that even took place. There's a strong desire there. That lust, it can mean sexual, but it can mean a lot of other things. It just means a strong desire. A strong desire is cultivated in the mind, and then that strong desire causes him to be enticed and led away, and then fall into sin. And when that sin is fully produced, it brings forth death. And so if we don't have control of our minds, then we will be easily enticed by the world, easily enticed by the flesh, easily enticed by whatever else we come into contact with, and we'll be easily dragged away from God and fall into various sins, perhaps even the sins that we were involved in before we were a Christian. And so for either reason, and then also for both reasons, it was important for Peter's readers and for us as well to take control of our minds, to gird up the loins of our mind. But then it doesn't stop there. He says, keep sober in spirit. New American Standard is supplying those words in spirit, but when you go back to original language, it can be translated that way. To keep sober in spirit. And that word also means to keep calm and collected. To keep control, I guess, of your mental states, your inward state, and to keep control of your emotions and other things like that. This would also be important for a person who's going through trials, particularly Peter's readers or whoever else, because usually when we go through a trial, that's when our minds just go crazy. We do things that we wouldn't normally do. We say things we wouldn't normally say because of whatever it is that we're going through. And Peter here is telling them, no, keep control of your spirit. Keep control of your inward self. That way you won't fall into doing things that you wouldn't normally do. Now, he's not preaching stoicism, which says that it's wrong to have any emotions. That is definitely not right. He's not saying keep sober in spirit. Don't ever have any emotions. Just always be straight, even keeled, never. No, if you read Paul's writings, that was an emotional man. When he was writing to people, sometimes he would be writing with tears streaming down his face because of his love for them. It's definitely okay to have emotions. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to be happy. It's okay to go through all the full range of that because that's just human experience. But what we don't want to do is allow that to draw us away from God and lead us into sin. We got to somehow keep the reins around it to where it doesn't get outside the sphere of where we ought to be. And so Peter here is trying to keep them kind of reined in, not to go crazy because of the trials that they're going under, but to kind of keep it all together. And he says, fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So you got the loins of your mind girded. In other words, you're in control of your mind. You're in control of your inward self. And then you are to fix your hope completely all the way to the end on the grace that would be revealed at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now this hope, it's very important to know what this hope is. When we talk about hope nowadays, we think about, well, I hope something's going to happen, right? I hope the Cowboys win the Super Bowl. Well, that in itself should show that hope doesn't necessarily mean that something's going to happen. It just means that you kind of wish that it would happen, that it would occur. The hope in the Scriptures, at least the way it's being used here, is the assurity of something that's about to happen. You have hope because you know it's going to happen in the future. Okay, so I might be going through a hard time at work. Maybe I'm working a lot of hours, but I know that big paycheck is coming. Those overtime hours are going to pay off. So I have, in the hope of getting that big paycheck, I'll work a lot of hours to acquire that. That's kind of the difference. It's the difference between hoping and actually knowing and fixing your hope upon what you know. So he says, fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So look forward to this thing. It's very important that we have a hope that is looking forward and not looking back. We have a lot of things in the Christian faith that we can look back on. We can look back on the sacrifice of Christ. We can look back on the fact that we are new people in Christ. all the blessings that Peter had already talked about in this first chapter. But we also have things to look forward to. And what that does is that gives us encouragement to make it through the trials and to do the work that God has called us to do. As Paul would say in the book of Romans, hope that is seen is not hope. If we've already acquired what we hope for, then it's not hope anymore. And it's important that we understand that it is in front of us. It's very easy, or it's a lot easier, let me put it that way, to work for something that's in the future than to work for something that you've already acquired in the past. The difference is that, let's say you're working for a brand new car, okay? And you're determined, you're not going to be in debt, you're not going to put a loan on it, you want to buy it in cash. And so you work for it and you work for it, but in hopes, as you're working, you have the hope of acquiring that vehicle that you've been wanting perhaps all your life. And you're working for it and you have that hope. And then you buy it and it feels so good that you work, but all that time you feel like you're working towards something. When you purchase a vehicle and you have to do a loan on it, you've already acquired what you wanted, but then you have to work for it. And that's not very much fun. Then you're just working to pay the bills. Because you've already acquired it, you don't really have the hope of acquiring it. You've already gotten it, but you still have to work for it. It's kind of the idea. We as Christians, yes, we have some things that we've already acquired in Christ, but thanks be to God, He's also given us some things to shoot for, to look forward to, that keeps us waking up in the morning, that keeps us sticking close to Him and being dedicated to the task that He has given us. And so we look forward to the fact that the grace that we have received through Jesus Christ will be in full revelation when He comes again. And then he mentions this grace, and this grace is very important because it is by grace that we are saved through faith. Ephesians chapter 2 talks about this. It's not of ourselves, it is the gift of God. Romans chapter 5, those first few verses, talks about we have access into this grace by faith, or we have access by faith into this grace by which we stand. It is by the grace of God. And we hope, and this hope is built upon the fact that it's by His grace, not based upon our works, on our goodness, our good looks, or our abilities. However, that doesn't mean that grace doesn't require something of us, because he mentions grace here, but then the very next verse he'll say, as obedient children, yada, yada, yada. He'll go on. And so the grace of God, yes, is enjoyed to us as a gift, but at the same time it lays upon us a responsibility to live according to the grace that has been expressed to us. Then we get into verse 14. It says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lust, which was yours in your ignorance. As obedient children, we know that through Jesus Christ we are the children of God. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1, it says, see how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we would be called children of God, and such we are. Through the rebirth, and Peter had already talked about this in verse 3, where he said we were born again to a living hope. And then he'll talk about this again in chapter 1 and 23. You have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable. There's a rebirth that has happened within us. Jesus told Nicodemus in John chapter 3, unless a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And we know that birth is a birth of the Spirit. Titus chapter 3 talks about the regeneration of the Holy Spirit. And so we have been reborn in God to become children of God. And so the calling there is that we would be obedient children, to bring glory and honor to God by being obedient to Him. There's nothing that brings more honor to a parent than to have a child that is obedient. There's nothing more embarrassing or dishonorable to a parent than to have a disobedient child. We want to be of those who are obedient, obviously. And he says, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. There was a time when we were ignorant. There was especially Peter's readers who come from a Gentile environment, maybe even from a dysfunctional Jewish settlement, depending on where they came from. There was a certain degree of ignorance there. And that ignorance led them into being involved in various lusts. They didn't know better. They didn't know about Christ. They didn't know about the glory of the revelation of Jesus Christ and the gospel. They didn't know all of those things. And so they were indulged in the desires of the flesh and the mind, walking according to the prince of the power of the air, according to the course of this world, as Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2. But because we have now become Christians and have the knowledge of the truth, there is no more excuse for sin. We should know better. We should not walk in the way that we did when we were ignorant. In chapter 4, we'll just fast forward a little bit to some verses that we'll cover later on in our study, Lord willing. And he says in verse 3, well, let's start in verse 1. Let's get the whole context. It says, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For the time has already passed sufficient for you to have carried out the desires of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. He says, the time has been enough for that. You've been out in the world, you've seen it all, you've been involved in all of those various lusts and desires. The time is sufficient. Now it's time to turn your attention to Christ. Now is your time to seek out a life of holiness before Him. Now, especially now that you have received the knowledge of the truth. With knowledge comes responsibility. And that's what Peter is calling his audience to do. So we should no longer be conformed to the former lusts. Going back to chapter 1. Now verse 15. He says, but as the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves in all your behavior. Because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. If we can call ourselves children of God, born by God, born of His Spirit, found a new life, and we become a new creation in Christ Jesus before Him, to become His children, doesn't it make sense that we would then imitate His attributes in our lives? Children, either for the good or for the bad, they are little imitators of their parents, either based upon the genes that they have received from their parents or through what they have seen their parents do. But many times children, not all the time, I'm not saying that children always imitate their parents, but that seems to be typical of children. Well, we want to be imitators of our Father in heaven. And our Father in heaven is a holy God. There's nobody like Him. He is righteous. He is holy. And we need to emulate that in our lives. Here he's quoting from the book of Leviticus. And there's actually several places. Leviticus 19:2 is one reference you could take, but there's others where they're told, the Israelites were told in the wilderness, be holy for I am holy. And the book of Leviticus is a book about holiness. If you wanted to sum up Leviticus, it's holiness. Where you're talking about the sacrifices, the Day of Atonement, the priests and their roles. All of it shows them as a holy people before God. And that is the call to them, and it's the call to us as well. If we are the people of God, we ought to be a holy people because He is holy. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll look at what a holy life looks like. We'll look at it in more detail. We're going to close out this section, but we're going to see next week, Lord willing, that a life of grace means a life of fear as well. Fear towards God. And we'll unpackage exactly what all that means next week. But with that, I'd like to open up the invitation to anyone who is here who would like to give your life to Christ, to enjoy the blessings, some of the blessings that we have mentioned here this morning, that Peter talks about in chapter 1. And to begin that new life, to become born again, to become a child of God. What a wonderful blessing that is. If you'd like to do that, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that Rodney has prepared.
The soul